History as It Happens, July 14th, 2022. Phyllis Schlafly Prevails.
I would like to thank my husband Fred for letting me come today. I love to say that because it irritates the women's livers more than anything that I say. The women's liberation movement is basically a very negative attitude toward life.
When you make the laws apply equally to men and women, you end up taking away many of the rights that women now have.
When you've spent these years doing dishes and diapers, you've got a living, breathing, loving, good citizen to show for your efforts.
The radical feminists who look upon the right to kill the unborn baby as the premier woman's right.
The overturning of Roe v. Wade wasn't merely the result of recent political developments. It was the work of a half-century of conservative activism, a grassroots movement that propelled the GOP further to the right. And few individuals were as important to that movement as Phyllis Schlafly. Her influence endures. And that's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
But more importantly, she saw that cultural issues could be linked to political issues, and Republican strategists saw the advantage of this, so they were able to reach out to traditional Christians, particularly Baptists and Catholics, and move them away from the Democratic Party.
The modern conservative movement was made possible by women like Phyllis Schlafly, whose activism helped make possible the demise of a constitutional right to an abortion. Now, it is true the conservative majority on the Supreme Court was made possible by what Senator McConnell did to Merrick Garland's nomination, the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg in September 2020, and as some liberals are keen to point out, the fact that 5 of the current Supreme Court justices were appointed by Republican presidents who lost the popular vote. But all that does not explain why the GOP became solidly, you might say monolithically, opposed to Roe v. Wade and abortion rights, to name one cultural issue that now animates a party whose centrist and liberal wings are long dead. To explain this seismic shift in Republican politics, one must look to the 1960s and 70s. So let's start with Barry Goldwater's resounding defeat to Lyndon Johnson in the 1964 presidential election. The conventional wisdom that followed said conservatism as an electoral force was dead. Goldwater was simply too far to the right. LBJ won by 16 million votes, good for 61% of the popular vote and 44 states in the Electoral College. One of Goldwater's most important backers was Phyllis Schlafly, then 40 years old and the president of the National Federation of Republican Women, and also a member of the Nut Fringe, as one of her Republican critics put it. Well, Schlafly lost her bid to remain the National Federation's leader, but as the historian Jill Lepore writes in her book These Truths, A History of the United States, Schlafly was not so easily defeated, and she would become one of the most influential women in the history of American politics. Schlafly recalled the dark days after Goldwater's defeat when she spoke at CPAC in 1989, a much brighter time for conservatives. And that was her point. You don't give up, you fight for your cause to persuade enough people to see it your way.
If there are any old-timers here in the room, you may remember that back in the 60s and the 70s, the psychology of defeat was pervasive among conservatives. We were a bit saddled with what I call the Goldwater syndrome, the notion that since we had our one big chance with Barry Goldwater in 1964, we had now seen clear proof that nobody to the right of Richard Nixon could ever be elected president of this country. And conservatives at the grassroots level had this attitude of defeatism. They woke up in the morning thinking, how many times am I going to lose today?
Phyllis Schlafly's cause was feminism. She waged war against it, fighting the Equal Rights Amendment and abortion rights in a crusade to preserve what she believed was a woman's rightful place in society. She galvanized a citizens' army to knock on doors and lobby lawmakers. In 1972, she formed a volunteer organization called Stop ERA. STOP stood for Stop Taking Our Privileges. To Schlafly, what her opponents called equal rights were really an attack on a woman's privileged place in society, as she argued with feminist Betty Friedan in a debate on The Today Show in 1975.
But it also should bar those indirect quotas, which make women have to have higher grades than men to get into the same school and so on. But we already know that even that law isn't being enforced. In other words,
name one school where women have to get higher grades to get into school.
Oh, this is
name one.
This is true in universities. I could name it. I could name 30, 40, 50.
Don't name 30. Just name one.
What?
One school where women have to get higher grades to get into school.
I would have suggested the viewers to tell Mrs. Schlafly the situation of the. I can name any number of them, so I'm not going to name.
Well, okay. The upshot of what you said is that Smith and Wellesley would be forbidden to maintain themselves as all-women schools and would be required to go co-ed without any quota.
The campaign to stop ERA worked, but the battle over abortion continued into the 1980s and beyond. Not just nationwide, I'm talking about within the Republican Party. If your living memory of politics only covers, say, the past 20 years, you may be unaware that many prominent Republicans were pro-choice, at least for a while, in the 1970s, like Richard Nixon. First Lady Betty Ford, in an interview with CBS's Morley Safer in 1975, heralded Roe v. Wade.
I feel very strongly that it was the best thing in the world when the Supreme Court voted to legalize abortion and, in my words, bring it out of the backwoods and put it in the hospitals where it belonged. I thought it was a great, great decision.
Now, the GOP adopted a pro-life plank in the party platform in 1976, but well into the 1990s, Republicans were still not unified around it. Some continued to fight Schlafly's effort to prioritize such cultural issues. Listen to this report on CNN in 1992, before the start of the Republican National Convention in Houston.
Across from the Astrodome, a billboard proclaims 71% of the Republican Party is in favor of abortion rights, while the GOP platform is staunchly anti-abortion. No less a personage than the First Lady has described abortion as a personal decision. The man in charge of the Republican convention denies the Bush administration wants it both ways.
Is the Republican Party trying to have it both ways on abortion? I don't think so. I really think this is a very personal, a very sensitive issue. It is difficult to deal with in a political campaign.
And later in that same CNN report.
Well, what I think is that the pro-life plank has brought millions of the so-called Reagan Democrats, the independents, and pro-life Republicans to vote for our candidates. It's a winner. It helped Ronald Reagan for 2 times and George Bush. And I think the proof of that is in the fine speeches made by Governor Bob Casey of Pennsylvania, who has said that on the abortion issue, millions of Democrats have walked out of their party. And I say their loss is our gain.
Again, that was in 1992, and 4 years later, a pro-choice Republican congresswoman gave the keynote address at the Republican National Convention. But abortion opponents kept fighting to turn the party into what it is today. Grassroots conservatives, evangelical Christians, legal groups like the Federalist Society, party strategists and consultants, and elected officials all share the credit, or the blame, depending on which side you're on, for that victory. Donald Critchlow teaches American political history at Arizona State University. He is the author of Phyllis Schlafly and Grassroots Conservatism, A Woman's Crusade. Donald Critchlow, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Martin, for having me.
Before we get to Phyllis Schlafly and her legacy, I'm interested what brought you to this field as a historian. You've written quite a bit about grassroots conservatism and the conservative movement.
Well, many years ago, I finished a book on abortion and federal family planning. The book focused primarily on the elites and the movement for population control. Because I was researching, suddenly there emerged this anti-abortion movement, and I came out of the grassroots. And I was teaching at that point, having left Notre Dame. I was teaching at St. Louis University. I had been there for a couple of years as department chair. And a student told me that he was meeting Phyllis Schlafly, who I had never met. And so I asked if I could join the meeting. I met Phyllis Schlafly. She gave me a biography written by a journalist. I didn't think it was very good. So I suggested to her that she get that maybe I could write a good scholarly, objective history. And that way I could get at the grassroots movement, which she was the leader of. So anyway, she gave me complete access to all of her papers, including financial papers, including the Stop ERA papers, which were quite extensive. And I supplemented that research with research all over the country. So out of that came a book from Princeton University on Phyllis Schlafly and the grassroots conservatism.
You know, when we think of the founders of the modern conservative movement, if you will, I think people like William F. Buckley come to mind. Maybe in politics, Barry Goldwater. Where do you place Schlafly in all of this?
Well, I think Phyllis Schlafly was critical to the emergence of grassroots conservatism. And she had three strengths. One is that she was able to serve as a spokesman for the grassroots conservatives, many of them who were hard right and often were very suspicious of the Republican Party. But she was also able to serve the Republican Party and served as kind of a link between the grassroots conservative movement and Republican political campaigns. So, for example, she became a leading spokesman for Richard Nixon, who would not have been in 1968 a natural choice for a lot of grassroots conservatism. Her second contribution, I think this was fundamental, was that she led a movement, a grassroots movement, against the Equal Rights Amendment that had been proposed by Congress. And that became a national movement. She showed her organizational skills. But more importantly, she saw that cultural issues could be linked to political issues. And Republican strategists saw the advantage of this. So they were able to reach out to traditional Christians, particularly Baptists and Catholics, and move them away from the Democratic Party, both in the Midwest and the South.
And she was always involved in politics, going back to the 1940s. And she put it upon herself and her movement to change the Republican Party, right? Because at this time, well, especially the 1940s, and then there was the anti-communism of the 1950s. But when it comes to what we would call culture war issues today, abortion, gay rights, feminism, you name it, she had to change the Republican Party to come to her side on those issues, right?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. She became involved in Republican politics very early. After getting a master's degree in political science at Harvard, she returned to St. Louis and started working for a bank. And the person she worked for was quite conservative. He called himself an individualist, which would later become kind of a libertarian. But I think that was part of her political education. In 1948, having just returned to St. Louis, she became a campaign manager of all things. I think she was in her early 20s at that point, 24 maybe. And she ran a successful campaign for a Republican congressman in St. Louis. So right from the beginning, she was involved in Republican politics.
And she even ran for Congress, didn't she, in the 1950s and lost?
She would meet her husband, Fred Schlafly, who was a practicing lawyer from a well-established family across the river, the Mississippi River in Alton. He was older than she was, but he was quite prominent. At a meeting with the head of the Republican Party in that district, they were talking about candidates, and Phyllis, in a kind of her typical way, said, well, why don't I run? And so I think it kind of shocked her husband and the GOP chair. And they said, okay, let's give it a try. It was a district in Illinois that was quite expansive and heavily Democratic. But, you know, there she was on the campaign trail. And I have to say, just a little story,
go ahead,
Martin, that Phyllis was quite formal. Behind the scenes, she had a very good sense of humor and was quite charming. But her public persona, I think even from an early age, was pretty formal. So in my research, I came across a picture of her at the county fair with a big hat and her daughters there, her children. And it looked pretty humorous because I could imagine Phyllis wearing kind of a funny hat. But there she was at the county fair that was going to be judging livestock. So anyway.
Well, that was unusual for a woman to run for Congress in 1952. She lost. Did she see any contradiction in her own career pursuits? Because she also was committed to what you might call traditional gender roles.
There were other Republican women in Congress at that point, so she wasn't completely alone. But it was rare. But the Republican women's clubs played an important role in Republican politics. So this issue that Phyllis Schlafly pursued a political career, yet said that women's and mothers' primary responsibility was in the home, has been brought up by left-wing historians and suggesting that it was contradictory. The fact of the matter is, Martin, the traditional gender role or the role of women in American history has been one of taking care of children, taking care of the home, hearth and home, being involved in civic affairs. Women played a very important role in the anti-slavery movement, the temperance movement, the prohibition movement, and school movements to create schools. So it wasn't contradictory at all to be a traditional woman and have traditional views and be involved in civic life.
So her first cause was international communism in the 1950s. Was she a McCarthyite, which was more concerned with domestic communism?
She was involved in the anti-communist movement. But, McCarthyism is a derogatory term of, making it look like a witch hunt. And so she led the anti-communist movements and she created schools. But if you look at the school programs, which hundreds of people attended, they were looking at congressional documents, particularly coming out of the House on American Activities, but also other Senate investigating campaigns. Just as they've portrayed Phyllis Schlafly as a hypocrite, they've portrayed a lot of the anti-communist activists in this period, the grassroots activists, as a bunch of nut jobs. Obviously, there were extremists within the grassroots movement who saw a communist under every bed. But most of the schools and many of the speakers told those attending that they needed to be educated, they needed to be informed, and they should be cautious in their accusations of who was a communist and who wasn't. They made a distinction between democratic liberals and actual communists. And later, if I may add just briefly, we do know from research and the KGB files in the Soviet Union during that brief period when there were open relations with the Soviet Union, that there were extensive spy networks, Soviet spy networks, using Americans in Washington. What was seen as false accusations in the 1950s proved to be true, with active communist spies in government.
Well, the thing about McCarthyism was he wasn't going after real spies. He went after small fry, people who were of no real concern.
We actually know that within the executive office, the president's office, there was an active spy. There were spies in the passport office, even the CIA, what was the predecessor, OSS.
You're talking about in the 1940s.
In the 1940s, right, not into the 50s, 30s and 40s. But, this has all come out. And the fact of the matter is, many of today's historians who are concerned with cultural, social, racial issues have basically ignored great research that has come out in the 90s about Soviet spy activity.
Yeah. So strictly speaking, she was not a McCarthyite.
No, I don't think she was a McCarthyite.
Yeah. So,
whatever that means.
So she moves, well, she doesn't leave anti-communism entirely, but she starts to add, Phyllis Schlafly does, more issues to her agenda, if you will. After the cultural liberalism of the 1960s, she then wants to take on feminism. Eventually, she takes on the ERA. She links the battle against the ERA to her battle against legalized abortion. Why did she believe feminism was bad for women?
So the transition from anti-communism to she became involved in defense issues, saw herself as a defense expert. and then moves to cultural issues, the social issues, feminism. And that's an interesting transition, and I don't think it was a natural one. She was invited to give a talk to a Republican club, and they wanted her to speak on ERA. And Phyllis Schlafly, being a Republican at that point, was for ERA, articulated in the 1920s by the Republican Party. But she agreed to speak on that, and they told her to do more reading. And as she began to read on this, she saw that what was being proposed in the new amendment was quite different than what the Republicans had proposed. And then she began to see feminism as she read more in preparation for her talk, that feminism was something new, it was radical, it wasn't the kind of, quote, feminism that she would have supported of equal opportunities. So Phyllis Schlafly showed great strategic ability, said that the anti-ERA folks needed to unite around a single slogan, stop ERA, and that they could have many reasons for opposing it. But she saw radical feminism as something new, a start of a cultural revolution, and she warned the American people, especially women, about it. It should be made very clear, Martin, that Phyllis Schlafly did believe that women should have careers. If they wanted, they should go into business and pursue opportunities outside the home. But she always emphasized that if a woman was a mother, their primary responsibility should be for her children. And that did not preclude working and taking care of your children.
I watched a debate she engaged in against Betty Friedan, and I remember her saying, I watched this, of course, many years after the fact. I'm only 46 years old. And she explained why she opposed the ERA.
ERA is a big attack on the rights of the homemaker. The laws of every state make it the obligation of the husband to support his wife, to provide her with a home, to support their minor children. The woman in the home can draw Social Security benefits based on her husband's earnings, even though she's been a homemaker all her life. Now, all these things will be lost when you apply a rule that says that everything must be equal. Now, until you can make it equal for men to have the babies just like women, then it is a double burden to the women to say that the rules for family support should be equal on the husband and the wife. ERA ends up in taking away the right of the wife to be supported by her husband and to have the right of to get credit in the stores based on her husband's earnings and all the rights of a wife.
I think to a modern audience, or maybe some of our younger listeners, might find that a bizarre thing to say.
Well, I think, Martin, you, by the way, you look younger than
thank you.
in your mid-40s, so you must have good genes. I'm not so sure that the modern listener would find that really alienating, that women should take care of their children, as we see what's really a crisis in our country that's been occurring for quite a while. The lack of parental direction and the breakdown of the traditional family is having all kinds of very serious consequences. And we don't need to run through those consequences, but I think Americans understand that we do have a crisis in the breakdown of our traditional family.
You can listen to what she was saying and picture in your mind a meek little 1950s housewife waiting for her husband to come home from work with the pipe and the slippers and all that. But that's not what Schlafly meant, right? She was obviously not a meek or tame person.
Yeah, Phyllis was a quite strong person, and one does have to understand how vilified she was at the time. She was getting death threats and shouted down, and really hated.
Someone threw a pie in her face at one point.
Someone threw a pie in her face. And the children, by the way, were concerned about her and asked her to get security, which she refused. So she was a very strong woman. And Miss America, which was an HBO series a couple years ago, portrayed Phyllis Schlafly as this kind of meek, subservient woman to Fred Schlafly, who was seen as kind of a misogynist. Well, I can tell you, Phyllis Schlafly, while having great respect for Fred Schlafly and often deferring to him in his decisions, was an exceptionally strong woman, spoke up, and was not coming home from speaking tours to a husband who was going to demand sex as Miss America depicted her. It was really foul scene. Phyllis Schlafly, who was older than she was, had never been married, had great respect for Phyllis Schlafly. And if anyone knew Phyllis Schlafly, you knew that you had to respect her. She demanded it.
And that was a Cate Blanchett movie, I think you're referring to?
Yes,
I think
so. I'm not, yeah.
I want to return to one of my earlier points. I wish I had spent more time on it. We'll return to it now about, the Republican Party, before these, what we now call culture war issues, became so important to the Republican Party's base. I think some of our younger listeners might be stunned to learn that at one point, Richard Nixon was pro-choice. Gerald Ford, his wife, Betty Ford, she praised the ruling Roe versus Wade. And even into the 1990s, actually, I'll finish this point. I was watching a news segment on YouTube the other day from the 1992 Republican National Convention that year, which nominated George H.W. Bush against Bill Clinton. And even then, Republican Party figures, despite the fact that the platform by then had been pro-life, several prominent Republicans, including Barbara Bush, were still pro-choice, and the party was still grappling with this. They didn't want to alienate the growing power of Christian evangelicals and Catholics who are in the Republican Party's base. But at the same time, they also wanted to keep, I guess, what you would call today suburban women, in the coalition. So how important was Schlafly to making the Republican Party monolithically pro-life?
You could have added Ronald Reagan when he was governor of California.
Signed a very liberal abortion bill,
passed the most liberal abortion law in the country at that point. Later, it was Nelson Rockefeller, who was a Republican governor from New York, passed an even more liberalized abortion law. So it was going to be a fight within the Republican Party. During the fight in California with the proposed legislation under Reagan, grassroots movement sprang up, and then it spread across the country. It was primarily Catholic women, but then soon began to incorporate Protestant women and began to expand from just being white women to a very racially diversified movement. So it's out of that grassroots movement that led the Catholic Church, which historically had been opposed to abortion. The Catholic bishops mobilized, and that became a bulwark in the fight against abortion. This grassroots movement that put pressure on the Republican Party to become pro-life really was instrumental in changing American opinion. And so if you look at polling right after Roe, most Americans accepted abortion. That's gradually going to change, largely through educational efforts, mobilization of Christian groups, Catholic and Protestants and Mormons, but also because I think of technology as we learn more about conception and the development of babies, fetuses themselves. So views have changed on this, and I think it's a success, a remarkable success of showing how citizens involved in their communities can change politics.
When it came to getting that change, it was a matter of getting Christian evangelicals to align with Catholics and Southern Democrats, right? To get all of them into the Republican Party fold. Schlafly was at the center of that?
Yes, I think she played a central role in that because in the Stop ERA movement, which primarily took place in southern states, they were the last battleground states, the women there found that they found a natural constituency within their churches, white and black, on stopping ERA. These churches, the South had been generally Democratic. Suddenly, in mobilizing them against Stop ERA, they're going to move to the Republican Party. So that becomes a Republican strategy. But it's just not high political operatives taking an opportunity. Politics works as a reflection of larger public opinion and constituencies. It's just not a group of people in Washington saying, we're going to pick this issue and use it opportunistically because we see that's the way of winning elections.
No, I
what
agree with you.
politicians and strategists do is look at where the people are. Public attitudes get reflected in politics.
The grassroots movement here against abortion, against ERA, was critical to influencing the direction of the party elites, who, as I mentioned, even into the 1990s were still, some might say, wishy-washy on the issue of abortion. They wanted to say it's a private matter and we don't want to get involved in it. I mean,
I think it was even more than that, Martin. I mentioned that my early book was on population control and federal family planning. Republicans were at the forefront of this effort for population control. George H.W. Bush, who you mentioned when he was in Congress, headed the Republican caucus on population control. Rockefeller and his brother were very involved in movements for population control that begin on the international level and then come back to America. So Nixon, in his first term, became very involved in population control and efforts at federal distribution of contraception and even sterilization, which were primarily aimed, by the way, at minority communities. For some Republicans, conservatives, but they were Republicans and Democrats, they saw reducing the number of poor children would be ultimately a way of reducing welfare costs.
The idea was that there were too many people in the world and there weren't enough resources for all of them. Is that right?
Yeah, well, that was part of it. So after World War II, foundations, military, Washington establishment began to look with genuine concern, how can we prevent the next war? And they saw World War II being caused by excess population. So they had good intentions, and so they wanted to control world population. As they turned to America, they thought that population should be controlled here, particularly poorer people. And by the way, they were also concerned with the environment and also concerned with immigration. They actually wanted restricted immigration.
I want to go back to Schlafly and her approach. Every movement needs different people, different roles, right? So maybe William F. Buckley was one of the intellectual pillars of the modern conservative movement. Schlafly was learned. She was a prodigious writer, but she wasn't a grand thinker, right? Her skills were in organizing and the Eagle Forum. What was the Eagle Forum?
So that came out of the Stop ERA movement. It became a national organization, was quite vibrant in its time. It began to languish, but still exists. And in some states, they wielded considerable power. Texas being one of those, as well as some other states. So it was a grassroots movement to reflect a range of economic, military, strategic, as well as cultural issues.
Yeah, she had her armies, they were called, right, who went out and just knocked on doors. I mean, to the issue of how they were able to affect this change in politics. It was shoe leather activism, so to speak.
Yes, and Phyllis's great skill was not, as you said, to be an original thinker, but she could articulate large issues, sometimes very complex issues, in a way that could be understood by average Americans in her writing and also in her speaking. And I might add that Phyllis Schlafly was very devoted to her family up until the moment of her death, but also was a workaholic. I remember as she invited me to go to a Republican victory party, a large one in Missouri. So it was about 11 o'clock when the celebration was still going on. And I happened to drive by her house. There I saw her working in her office at 11 o'clock at night. Shortly afterwards, she had a appendicitis attack. She had to go in for emergency operation. She didn't tell anyone about it. The day following her release from the hospital, she was in the office. Her opponents saw her as a demon, and she was a demon for work.
Betty Ford, Gerald Ford's wife, I mentioned before, pro-choice. She celebrated Roe versus Wade. Betty Ford called Phyllis Schlafly a crank and said she wouldn't waste her time debating her. Why did people underestimate Phyllis Schlafly?
You know, it was easy to do. She portrayed herself as a housewife. And so they invited her to debates. I remember watching in her extensive archives a video of a professor who was anxious to debate her, Being a PhD and being intellectually clever, you could take care of Phyllis Schlafly, who was coming out from a small town, Alton, Illinois, a housewife, and they just totally underestimated. She was a wicked debater.
Could she be a demagogue at times?
I wouldn't accept that characterization of her. Her talks were usually quite logical. She wasn't given one to shouting.
But she did like to get a rise out of her opponents, though.
Yeah, but she did. I mean, she would bait them. Some of the television appearances, she began by saying she wanted to thank her husband for allowing her to be on the television show. And that was just a bait. So I saw that as kind of a reflection. It's kind of her humor in a way, but I wouldn't consider that demagoguery per se. But, Phyllis Schlafly was not a saint. I got to know her very well. She had her flaws. My biography of her was quite objective. I tried to be fair to her, allow her to articulate her positions, but also suggested where she was a little off. I am a conservative and a Republican, but Phyllis Schlafly always thought maybe I was too soft and a little airhead intellectual and didn't quite know what was going on in the real world of politics. But anyway, she may have been a little right about that, but we have our differences politically.
Historian Jill Lepore, who is not a conservative Republican, wrote a book called These Truths, which is a wonderful one-volume history of the entire United States. She writes, Schlafly, blonde and petite, wore flawlessly pressed pink skirt suits and pumps. She liked to talk about herself as a housewife and mother of 6, but she was also ruthless and she was learned, and people who underestimated her nearly always regretted it. Tying the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, to abortion was a stroke of political genius. And to better debate her opponents in realizing that much of this political battle would be waged in the courts, Schlafly earned a law degree in the 1970s. She was not a flake, writes Lepore. She was as keen as the most cunning battlefield general.
This was one of the criticisms by her opponents in Stop ERA, that she didn't really know law. So in the midst of this fight, incredibly, she applied and was admitted to Washington University Law School. So she went full-time as a law student, graduated at the top of her class, and at the same time organized the national movement, extensive speaking engagements, television appearances before state legislatures. And that's what I meant, that she was a workaholic. And I love our English language, it's rich. But, to describe Phyllis Schlafly as ruthless, it's kind of a word that suggests that, she wasn't principled. And Phyllis Schlafly was very principled. I'm not sure where Jill Lepore gets the word ruthless, but I know Jill Lepore wouldn't use that on any BLM activist. Sorry, Jill.
Well, if Jill listens to this and gets in touch with me, I actually have emailed her, invited her on. That was months ago. I never heard back from her. Anyway, that's not important. So what was Schlafly's approach to ending legalized abortion or overturning Roe versus Wade? I guess that's the first step. She was opposed to abortion personally. She was Roman Catholic. But what was her approach politically? Was it as simple as we need to elect Republicans and Republican presidents will appoint pro-life judges or anti-Roe judges?
I mean, Phyllis would have been on the side of banning abortion. She was Roman Catholic. But within the convention, as this played out as in the Republican Party platforms, she was also for compromise. And in fact, when Ronald Reagan was nominated, Phyllis and her Republican delegates and her caucus decided to drop ERA from the platform. So that was one of Phyllis's great strengths, was kind of a pragmatism, understanding what was necessary for success in politics while organizing grassroots conservatives, many of them who were firebrands. And today we do not have that kind of grassroots leadership anywhere, I think.
Recently, Independence Day holiday, there were a lot of young people online saying they don't want to. They're done with the system. It's rotten. Voting is pointless, etc. Those types of ideas Phyllis Schlafly would never Well, anyone who thinks you have to embrace political solutions to social problems wouldn't embrace that thinking. Let's get to that in a little bit.
Okay.
So maybe this is an impossible question to answer. Would the end of Roe versus Wade have been possible had it not been for Schlafly's life work? I mean, I guess how important was she?
I think Phyllis was important, but it was the movement itself that was larger than Phyllis. The support of the Catholic Church and then later Protestant churches, I think, were critical in this. So I don't think it should be attributed to a single individual, even though they played an important role, as Phyllis Schlafly did. They did lay out a political strategy. One of the arguments against ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, that was such a broad amendment, saying that women should have equal protection. They were concerned that it was so broad that it would be taken to the courts. And at that point in the 1970s, conservatives didn't have any faith in the courts. What is interesting is, I think, and important, is that the conservatives saw the courts as important, began to organize through the Federalist Society law students and young lawyers, and they built a movement to change the courts. So the Federalist Society played a very critical role in all of this, but it was supported by grassroots activism and the mobilization of Republican voters. So it's been a long struggle to get to the overturning of Roe and turning the abortion issue back to the states. By doing so, we'll be much more in line with Western European countries, which have much stricter abortion laws than we do in this country.
Yeah, through legislation, not lawsuits in the courts. That's
right.
They handle it in the Democrat.
We're going to see a lot of lawsuits, though.
We already have, I guess.
You made a decision to become a journalist and not a lawyer, so you might have you might have been better off in law. But anyway, well, I won't give career advice. I'm a professor, so who should take advice from a professor on careers?
Well, I don't know how good I am at what I'm doing, so maybe the law would have been a better.
You seem quite good. Go on.
No, your point there about the Federalist Society and looking to the courts, that's interesting because for a long time, really decades, liberals viewed the courts as the place where they could secure rights. So I guess the tables are turned now.
Yeah, I think the one way of looking at the progressive views of the courts, if you look at the early civil rights movement, it's going to culminate with Martin Luther King's movement, the Civil Rights Act of 64 and Voting Rights Act of 65. That came out of the grassroots movement because the political climate began to change in reaction by the public to a bunch of issues in the late 60s, a perceived decline of American power, but more importantly, law and order. You're going to see a shift in a more conservative direction to voters. And progressives, unless you're in really what we would call blue states, began to see that they were losing out. So they turned to the courts to push a lot of their social agenda. It was in the Supreme Court under the Warren Court earlier. It began to filter down to federal courts. Meanwhile, the conservatives were mobilizing on a grassroots basis. But ultimately, they too saw the courts as important. And so that became part of the political campaign to get good justices on the Supreme Court and good federal court appointees.
If anyone listens to Ted Kennedy's Robert Bork's America speech, Kennedy mentions the courts.
And the doors of the federal courts would be shut on the fingers of millions of citizens for whom the judiciary is and is often the only protector of the individual rights that are the heart of our democracy.
Many of your younger listeners won't know about the Bork hearings. He was nominated by Ronald Reagan. He came across as a professor. He had kind of a straggly beard, was not very personable. And in the hearings, he was vilified by both Ted Kennedy as well as Biden. And so conservatives saw it as, and they used the phrase, borking. But we see this kind of vilification of Republican nominees to the Supreme Court and the federal court. It's not healthy for our society, actually.
Well, the abortion issue is now out of the way when it comes to Supreme Court nominees, I suppose. Roe is dead and not coming back, so they'll have to talk about something else the next time there's an opening, right? Which I think will be good, right? I don't think it was good to have this one issue so important. Obviously, abortion is an important issue, but it dominated the entire nomination process.
Yes, I agree with you.
It took this movement, of which Phyllis Schlafly was a key part, a half a century to achieve their goal of overturning Roe versus Wade. I mean, that should tell us something, right, about what might be an overreaction on the part of some people who are very unhappy with the Supreme Court right now. They're saying, basically, to hell with the system. Voting doesn't matter because of the filibuster. We have these unelected Supreme Court judges. They were appointed by presidents who lost the popular vote. A litany of complaints about what's going on right now by many on the left. Not all, but a good number, especially younger liberals. What's the lesson here about you can't just have activism outside of politics?
I think you made a very good point, and let's go back very quickly to the ERA struggle. So Phyllis, in her immobilizing on the local level and the state level to get state legislators who had to vote on this amendment to ratify it, they were quite political. So they did corny things like give baked pies, break bread, and they gave them to legislators, and some of them, they ended up voting against them, and Phyllis directed those on the local level to tell the legislators who had voted against them, okay, you voted against us this time. We're going to come back. We're going to talk more about this. But here, have a loaf of bread. That was politics. They understood that you needed to persuade. Meanwhile, the Stop ERA activists, particularly now, National Organization for Women, saw the struggle. They took it to the streets. They saw it as kind of the civil rights movement. They did things such as pour blood in the halls of the Illinois state legislature. They came across as wild-eyed, and a little bit crazy, and they failed. What we saw in Roe was the success of a long-term democratic mobilization. And the way that was done was through education. And I think the demonstrators today talking about cheering that they've had abortions is exactly the same mistakes they made when they lost the ERA. So they need to learn that you need to persuade, and you're just not talking to yourselves.
There was a story today that some people were protesting outside the restaurant where one of the Supreme Court justices was having dinner because they're unhappy about the overturning of Roe. I don't think they're interested in changing anyone's mind. So just one final thing about the ERA. If it weren't for Phyllis Schlafly efforts, the Constitution probably would have been amended, right? What did you say?
It was well on its way to passage. She single-handedly, with her supporters, defeated it. It was a remarkable political campaign. But it also should be noted that on the state level, state legislatures passed ERA amendments. And one of Phyllis's warnings about ERA on the national level, it was going to have a lot of unforeseen consequences, from abortion to same-sex marriage. And so the same-sex marriage, which I'm not arguing for or against, I'm only making an observation that came out of a Massachusetts case in which they had a pro-ERA amendment to their constitution. In many ways, Roe should be seen as a success by the conservative pro-life movement, but the cultural right has lost on a lot of cultural issues too. So that's where we're at. We're still in the midst of a cultural war.
Well, you are right about that, Don Critchlow. We thank you for your time and insights. The abortion battle, of course, isn't over yet. It has moved from the federal courts to the state courts and state legislatures. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to take a look back at the year 1979 as President Biden visits the Middle East. That year still looms large in our current events. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.